for providing product sustainability information. So my name is Niels Hoyer and I work for the UN Environment and in the coordination desk of the One Planet Network Consumer Information Program. The webinar has been jointly organized with the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program to start an exchange of ideas around consumer information and how the guidelines that we present today can be applied in the buildings and construction sector. We will start off with a presentation of the guidelines and then have further inputs from the SPC program and a moderated discussion at the end. All attendees are on mute, but you can write in questions and we will pick them up later in the discussion. And please let us know if there are any technical issues or comments during the presentations. Before we go into the topics, I would just quickly give an overview of the Consumer Information Program. Our program is co-led by the Environment Ministries of Germany and Indonesia and Consumers International. And our program's main objective is to support the provision of quality information on goods and services and effective strategies to engage consumers in sustainable consumption. One of our main outputs of the program are the guidelines that we will present to you today. And another main work stream we have is on Type 1 eco-labels as a tool for more sustainable consumption and production. Unlike the SPC program, we are not focused on a specific sector and therefore really appreciate exchanges like the webinar today so we can see how the guidelines can be applied in a specific sector. You can find more information on our One Planet Network website and also sign up to our newsletter if you're interested to receive more information from our program. Now I'm handing over to my colleague Pekka, who will give the introduction for the SPC program.
Thank you, Niels, and thank you for inviting us to join this webinar. We're very happy to collaborate with other One Planet Network programs. There were also public procurement and lifestyle education, at least, that were registering to this webinar. Our program is led by the Ministry of Environment from Finland and strongly supported by two co-leads, RMIT University of Australia and UN Environment. They are shown in green in this map. We have also active, let's say, 23 MAC members marked yellow and partners consisting of, let's say, 70 international experts with whom we are implementing the project objective or program objectives. We have the mandate to implement SDG 12 on this sustainable consumption and production together with our network, which is shown there, a foundation of this SDG house, and we intend to provide healthy environments that provide also employment to the local actors in innovative environments in cities by mitigating climate change and adapting to that. We have focused our activities into two areas. One on responsibly sourced materials in circular built environments, both of which require reliable data on which materials should be used and how circularity can be measured. The other thematic focus area is affordable and resilient built environment. So these two thematic focus areas are then defined into the signature products that we intend to implement in the partner countries. In this webinar, our objective is to develop and also hear your views on how we will be able to provide access to reliable and relevant information that is also useful and transparent in the decision making in the whole supply chain in the built environment that consists of a number of partners. So you have to have continuous interoperable exchange of information there. And the webinar will start by the introduction by Bettina Heller on what the Consumer Information Program has worked on the general guidelines. And then we try to look at it in different, let's say, in our sector by firstly presenting two of our trust fund project approaches. So Zeenat Niazi will start it by explaining how mainstreaming affordable sustainable housing project approaches this product information, followed by Jesus Salcedo from UN Habitat headquarters on how the design tools take into consideration of these aspects. And at the end of after these two short project descriptions, Jeremy Gibbert from South Africa will give general remarks. He has very long experience in assessing sustainability of buildings in the developing countries where the certificates and labeling schemes developed in the global north don't always function so well. And the main intention is then to have active discussion and debate on these matters, on which are the steps ahead. And just before handing it over to Bettina, to remind that we have also next week webinars on more about this sustainable affordable housing project in India, and also about one certification schemes on homes that is developed by IFC, part of the World Bank Group. And we are also planning events to be held. We have a side event on circular economy or circular built environment in COP25 in Santiago on the 4th of December. We are submitting a similar proposal to World Urban Forum 10 in Abu Dhabi as a follow-up to the previous one, WUF 9 in Kuala Lumpur. And we aim to launch the main outcome of the program in next June in the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference in Gothenburg. And we're very happy to also have the other programs and other experts taking part in this or joining this event in June. But now we are going to make like country assessments end of this year, and then implement our products until the end of this program by 2022. So we have still a couple of years time in order to justify our impacts, what have we've been achieving by mitigating climate change and adapting to it, and how that supports the local job creation and also capacity building of all stakeholders. So it's just a general instruction or introduction, and without any further delay, I hand it over to you, Bettina, to tell about what CIP program has done here.
Thanks, Pekka, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I think we also have quite a few people from the Australian Asian part of the world joining, so it must be late for you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm gonna give you some of the context and the general background to these guidelines for providing product sustainability information. This is a tool that was developed by UNEP together with the International Trade Center in the framework of the Consumer Information Program. So we have a working group with experts in the field of product sustainability information who helped us to develop these guidelines, and who are now also helping us to roll them out and implement them. If we can go to next slide, please.
You should be able to do it.
Okay, yeah. Good. I'll try. So the objectives of the guidelines are to contribute to the achievement of SDG 12. If we look at SDG 12, especially important for us in this context is target 12.8, which is around ensuring that people will have relevant information and awareness for sustainable development and lifestyles. When we started to embark on this journey to develop these guidelines, which were released in 2017, we had two key objectives, let's say. One was to set a common ground of minimum requirements to improve the reliability of consumer information and to remove the potential for greenwashing. So really in terms of the minimum requirements that have to be taken into account when communicating about product sustainability to consumers. Just a side note, consumers in this context might be individuals, but also business or governments. And then our other objective was also to go beyond that. So to actively encourage organizations to take leadership in this space and to always improve over time, because, well, there's always room for improvement, as we know. And we think especially the topic of consumer information is one that there can always be more and more interesting initiatives that come up. So these are the two main objectives. In terms of target audience, we see the guidelines as being used by three different groups. One of them are the ones that provide information on product sustainability. So that would be companies, marketing professionals, the ones that really do the communication. Then the second group are the ones that provide schemes or policies around product sustainability information. So that could be certification bodies, labeling schemes, which can use the guidelines to adapt their existing schemes to make them more robust, or to develop new schemes where needed, and also governments, including procurement officers. And the third group are the ones that could be a bit the watchdogs, whistleblowers kind of group, which check the quality of existing product sustainability information, and we hope they can use the guidelines to compare existing information. And that could be trade unions, consumer organizations, market surveillance authorities. And then also, what kind of information do the guidelines actually cover? So you've heard in the title a lot, it's around providing product sustainability information. Our definition of products are goods and services. But it's important to take into account that we talk here really about goods and services, and we do not talk about general awareness raising about sustainability or general communication about a company's sustainability performance. It's really about the product. So that could be eco-label, certification schemes, voluntary standards, product declarations. So any way to communicate with consumers around the environmental, social, and economic issues that are connected to products. And you can see a few examples here, because we always first think about kind of a label on a product, but it could also be an online campaign, a video. It could be in the right corner here, you can see a shopping receipt, which outlines how much CO2 emissions were caused by the shopping basket, so to say, that I purchased. And I know that also for us, this covers all sectors. So we want the guidelines to also be applicable to the buildings and construction sector. And we're going to talk about an example later. But bear with us if some of our examples are more around, for instance, household products, to start explaining to you how those principles could work, and then we can jointly also develop how they then work in the buildings and construction sector. That's all from my side for now.
Okay, thank you, Bettina. So I will now go into the main content of the guidelines. So the guidelines are built around 10 principles, and as Bettina mentioned in the objectives, the idea was to have a certain minimum requirements to avoid greenwashing, but also encourage continuous improvement and inspire sustainability leadership. So we therefore have 2 sets of 5 principles each. Ones are called fundamental, that must be followed, and the other ones are aspirational, that should be met over time. And I will start by going into the fundamental principles. And these are reliability, transparency, relevance, accessibility, and clarity. And the aim is to provide effective, trustworthy sustainability claims about products. Regarding reliability, this principle asks for the information that is communicated to have a reliable and scientific basis. So claims need to be truthful and based on an accepted methodology and substantiated evidence. Methods and standards must be consistent with the claim that is made on the product. And this doesn't necessarily need to be built on third-party certification schemes, but it must have independent assurance or an endorsement by scientific institutions or governments to guarantee the reliability. For instance, the example that is presented here, a claim that a t-shirt is organic should be substantiated with an accepted standard for organic cotton, such as GOTS. The second principle is relevance, and this aims to ensure that all significant sustainability aspects are covered, to highlight product characteristics or innovations that really make a difference to the overall sustainability performance of the product. So the claim should be about an integral aspect of the product, for example, processes, materials, or impacts, and go also beyond the legal requirements. And the claim should also not highlight one positive aspect to mask other, maybe more important sustainability aspects where the product performs poorly, so to avoid burden shifting. For instance, the example that we have here that is not good is to say that a mattress is ozone friendly, because CFCs have already been banned, and also the impact on the ozone layer is not a hotspot for a mattress as a product. So this would be then misleading and not relevant for the consumer. The third principle of clarity is about delivering a clear and easy to understand message that provides a direct link between the claim and the product. It should help consumers understand their role in improving product performance and reduce the impact of their consumption. A nice example that we have here is from the recycling label from OPRL in the UK. You can see it in the picture on the left. So it gives detailed information which components of the packaging are recyclable, and also referring to the available recycling infrastructure. So it gives clear instructions for the consumer on what he has to do with the packaging and how it should be recycled. Clarity also means to avoid vague, ambiguous or broad claims about general sustainability benefits, such as saying something is green or eco or natural, because these general terms are not very clear what they mean for the consumer. So it must be associated with a known standard or label, or more information needs to be provided what is exactly meant by this term. And it's also important to clearly state the limits of the claim to not mislead the consumer that an entire product is sustainable if only certain aspects are addressed. The fourth principle is transparency. While it is not necessary, feasible, or desirable to provide all information underlying sustainability claims to the consumer at point of sale, because this could just be overwhelming the consumer and also lead to confusion, it is important that consumers who want to know more are able to find out how the claim was generated and by whom. The information must be made publicly available so consumers can evaluate themselves if the claim is accurate and reliable, and competent bodies must also get access to relevant confidential information to verify the claim. I mean, ideally, we think that information on environmental or social sustainability shouldn't be confidential, but that might not be always the case. And providing a sustainability claim without publishing any additional proof or information to support it is considered insufficient. The last of the fundamental principles is about accessibility. This means that the information must be clearly visible for consumers and be provided where and when it is useful. So quite often this is on the packaging itself, but it's also important that, for example, if the sustainability benefits are associated with the use of the product, not just the product in its production process, for example, or in its characteristics, then this information must also be always available for the consumer when he's actually using the product to really achieve the sustainability benefit that is being claimed. For example, if a detergent has a higher concentration and you can use less, then the consumer must also know that, otherwise the benefit will be lost. And another example of how to provide more information if the space on packaging, for example, can be limited, is to use QR codes, because nowadays a lot of people have mobile phones available to get more access to more information, or maybe instructions on how to use a product to make it more sustainable in the performance. And now we come to the aspirational principles. So these are meant to encourage a continuous improvement in the communication to the consumer, but also are trying to engage consumers more actively in the process. The first of the aspirational principles are the 3 dimensions. These should be ideally addressed. These are environmental stewardship, social inclusiveness, and economic issues. The focus should again be on the most relevant aspects for each product, while avoiding burden shifting between the dimensions. And I think it can be quite difficult for some of the labelings or certification schemes to properly address all 3 dimensions of sustainability, which is why we consider it an aspirational principle. But a good example would be the Fair Trade Tourism certification that manages to address all 3 dimensions. And another option is also to combine complementary certification schemes. A common example found is for fair trade certification combined with organic certification. So fair trade would then cover the social and economic criteria of sustainability, and organic certification the environmental criteria. The second aspirational principle is the principle of behavior change and longer-term impact. It aims to resolve the attitude, behavior, or value-action gap. This is meant that people often have positive attitudes towards sustainability, but then don't know or forget how to properly enact it. And the idea is by using behavioral insights, sustainability claims should be on simply informing consumers towards encouraging action that helps reduce the impacts of consumption, either through purchase, use, reuse, or disposal of products. And in that sense, it's also important to build a longer-term relationship with consumers to sustain the behavior change, monitor the impacts, and further educate consumers. And an example of a successful campaign was from Ariel when they had a campaign called Turn to 30 Degrees, where they tried to encourage people to wash at lower temperatures for the environmental benefits associated with that. And yeah, another interesting concept in this principle is nudging, which aims to guide people's behavior in a positive way without restricting choice through innovative measures and by using behavioral insights. And this leads also over to the next principle of behavior change and longer-term impact, which aims to resolve the encourages the use of multiple channels and the combination of different approaches to provide consumers with product sustainability information. So creative ideas and entertaining ways to present information and highlight sustainability issues can help raise attention and complement the fact-based presentation of relevant information at product level without overloading the consumers. Here we have a good example from Intermarché in France, when they had a campaign on inglorious fruits and vegetables. You can see the misshaped apple. Basically, the idea was to make people aware of food waste in general, and also convince them that food that is non-standardized, like fruits and vegetables, can still be tasty and also shouldn't be avoided in the consumption. And they used a lot of different channels to promote this campaign, such as marketing, advertising, social media, store rebrands, and also some incentives like giving discounts on inglorious fruits, or processing them to juices and soups to show that these can be used in these kind of situations. And the fourth aspirational principle is about collaboration. This is about engaging stakeholders in the development of sustainability claims and in the communication of them to consumers. By letting other actors participate, the public acceptance, credibility, and trust can be increased, and a wider audience can be reached. Using an inclusive language can also help make consumers feel part of a movement, and this feeling of social belonging or cohesion can reinforce behavior change across society. I think there's a lot of behavioral insights into the importance of social norms, or like societal factors and how they shape consumption behavior. And stakeholder engagement should be a continuous effort to enable evaluation and adaptation over time of the communication strategies. And the last principle that we had is comparability. This one intends to help consumers in their decision making by being able to compare similar products in their sustainability performance to choose the better option. In general, this is a very helpful principle or concept for consumers, because that really enables them to choose the more sustainable option between two comparable products. But it is in practice often complex to implement, which is why it's aspirational again. For example, comparative advertising is sometimes also strictly regulated by governments, and claim providers must make sure they carefully assess the methodological, evidential, and legal basis for their comparisons. So we recommend that they follow existing guidance or get involved in approaches that develop comparability criteria for certain product types and adhere to existing benchmarks. One good example of a comparable label is the energy class rating by the EU. It's a relative rating scheme that helps consumers compare appliances within a similar product class on their energy efficiency. But of course, energy efficiency is much easier to measure than certain sustainability aspects. I mean, in many other products, you would need a more detailed life cycle assessment to really compare products in their sustainability performance and make comparable claims. Okay, then now I will hand over to Bettina to present our experiences from our road testing exercise of these guidelines, and also to present to you a case study to illustrate how these principles can be applied in practice.
Thanks, Niels. And yeah, please bear with us. We know it's a lot of information, but hopefully also this case study will again give another example that will help to picture it more in practice. So this case study I'm going to present, we gathered in a road testing exercise that was happening throughout last year. Just to quickly give an overview, the objectives of this exercise were for us to understand how feasible it is to apply these 10 principles in practice on the ground in companies of different sizes, standard setters of different sizes and different sectors. We wanted to also identify where most of the challenges lie for the future work around product sustainability information, and then finally to collect good practices and case studies and lessons learned. So we had in total 28 companies and standard setters from all world regions participate in this exercise. And what they did is that they you can see them here, they chose one of their claims. So one means they used to convey product sustainability information to consumers. And then they analyzed that themselves against the 10 principles. So just to say that also what I'm presenting here, it's really a self-assessment by our road testers. So we do not make a value judgment and we do not endorse the claim, but we find it a useful exercise for you to see how these 10 principles can be applied to one claim in its full. So the one that I will talk to you about today comes from the Confederation of Indian Industry, who has developed this certification scheme called Green Pro. The mission of the Confederation of Indian Industry is to support growth of industry in India, and they are partnering with industry and government. And so this Green Pro, which is short for Green Product Certification, aims to help consumers make more informed choices as a label. It includes a range of different product categories, but there are a couple in the sustainable buildings and construction sector. So for instance, it covers products around from cement, construction aggregate, construction blocks, and construction chemicals and panels, as well as boards, insulation, paints and coating, and tiles. So this is just to list a few. You can find more on their website. What you can see here on the right is a snapshot of the actual case study, and we're going to provide a link later where you can download all of this information and have a more detailed read. Now, I'm not going to go into detail for each of the principles in the interest of time, so I'm going to be more detailed on some of them. I would like to talk to you about the principle of relevance, which again is about identifying and highlighting in the communication the most relevant hotspots or impacts of the product in terms of its life cycle, or to be very clear about where the boundaries lie about what we communicate. So here the Green Pro assessed relevant aspects for each product in areas that make a difference to its overall sustainability performance. And by assessing those aspects and awarding the label only to those products that fulfill those aspects, they try to ensure that it's relevant. Then I also wanted to speak to you about clarity. So in order to make it clear to the consumers which are the kind of products they choose from that bear the Green Pro label, and what does that mean. Actually, each of the products has a unique identification number, and the consumers can check that number to confirm the validity of the certification, and also get details around the features of the product. So which are the features that were actually assessed, and why are those important for the certification. Then the company that that gets the logo of the Green Pro for their product, they can then send that in, use that for promotional activities. And this should enable the architects, developers, builders, construction engineers, and consultants to then identify certified products. And again, as also we heard from Niels before, it's important that this information is clear. And also, if we go back to the aspirational principles, that it engages consumers for behavior change, because can imagine that also the construction engineers, the architects, when they take those decisions, there might be multiple different things that they have to take into consideration, and the easier it is for them to identify the products, the better. Now I'm gonna skip transparency and accessibility, but you're gonna get the slides also after the webinar, and we're also gonna give you the link to the case study to dig in deeper. What I also wanted to look with you at are the 3 dimensions of sustainability. So in the case of this Green Pro certification from CII, it looks into the environmental and social dimensions. The environmental dimension around design and performance, raw materials, manufacturing process, waste management, but it also takes in general an overall life cycle approach and looks at product stewardship and innovation. So how can products be improved constantly over time? And in terms of the social aspects, the Green Pro certification encourages the manufacturers to also look at measures around health and well-being of the building occupants, and that includes elimination of hazardous substances and the reduction in volatile organic compounds content. So it's mainly about the environmental dimension, but it also tries to encourage social benefits, and that this is also an aspirational principle. This is also something that we say in the guidelines. Maybe you start with one dimension, but then over time you add others, and you try to make it more complete, the communication. Then in behavior change and longer term impacts, found this also quite interesting to share with you. Is that after the assessment with each of the company's products, they receive a report which outlines the environmental impact and guides them in the adoption of environmental measures. So the aim is not only to provide maybe the certification, but to also change the behavior of the company, to encourage the company to continue improving their environmental and other credentials over time. And the Confederation of Indian Industries also tries to create awareness on sustainable procurement among architects, developers, builders, engineers, and consultants, to modify the procurement practices, so to also stimulate the demand for those certified products. And the manufacturers can also be involved in those awareness raising activities. And then the final one that I wanted to look at with you is multi-channel innovative approach. So here the tools that are used by this road tester are webinars and awareness raising programs, as well as newsletters. And they feature the certified products at conferences and training programs. So this is in terms of taking a multi-channel approach. However, they also recognize that in terms of the product level environmental performance, it's currently mainly communicated on the product, on the label. And this is actually something that in general from our road testing exercise, a lot of the feedback that we gathered from standard setting organizations such as the one here is that for them often it's it's a bit more difficult to engage with the consumers and to raise general awareness because their first clients are the businesses who then apply the label to their product. And most of them recognize a need to do more around generating general awareness around the label and the issues concerning the sustainability performance of products in a certain sector, so that there's also a stronger market for that. So this is around the case study. I'm going to skip the others, but you're going to get the slides and you can read through them. But I wanted to finish with where you can find all of this information and other tools. So we have a website on the One Planet Network website, which is called the Product Sustainability Information Hub. And you can find here the guidelines. So please download them and all have a read through. And also a report that's called Ready to Drive the Market. And this report holds all the general analysis that we drew from these 28 road testers in terms of what they thought worked well, where there's improvement. And I think also for all of you working in the building and construction sector, that could be useful to see what other support and what other tools and trainings might be needed in terms around product sustainability information in general, but then adapted to the buildings and construction sector. You can find the case studies there. So here are a few. We're still publishing them. We should shortly have all of them online, as well as a paper called Shout It Out, Communicating Product Social Impacts. Because one thing also that we found in the road testing is that mostly the communication is still around environmental issues, but there's not that much yet done around the social dimension. So this paper highlights some ideas and good practices around how that could be done. There's also an online self-assessment tool, which walks you through the 10 principles of the guidelines. So if you either want to analyze a claim yourself or you organize a workshop around this issue, you could use the self-assessment tool, which will ask you certain questions to start the thinking process within the company or within the organizations around what could be improved when communicating to consumers. And finally, we have a training of trainers toolkit. So if you yourself think, wow, the guidelines are a great tool, I want to apply this with my network, we'd be really happy about that. And you can get in touch with us and we can send you more information around how workshops around this topic could be organized. And here's the link where you can find it all, but we can also distribute this to you after the webinar. Thanks.
Yeah, we're going to hand over to Zenat now, who will introduce the Mashup project.
Thank you, Niels and Bettina. And good day, everybody. It's different times of the day from different parts of the world. What I'm going to do is take you very quickly through an experience of the Mashup intervention that we did, a research project that we did over the last 2 years, supported by the One Planet Network, which looks at how building products and technologies can be assessed, and that information can be used by different stakeholders. So if I can get the control, yeah, right. Okay, so the construction sector, as you see, has a huge impact on the environment, huge energy and material impact. In India, we also see that the largest quantum of the material that would be used, the mineral material that is going to be used going forward, is going to be with the housing subsector, and of that subsector, it's going to be the social and affordable housing space, which is going to be using the maximum amount of materials. So this project was actually inspired by looking at the sustainability of this material use in this large growing sector. And we find that this is a very interesting space as far as consumer information and procurement goes, because you have a potential private consumption of housing, but because it is within the social affordable space, which is regulated and supported and facilitated by the public sector, there is a mechanism by which you could incentivize sustainability. Besides only information, there are other ways of credit and other aspects that could support direct the consumer choice towards more sustainable options. And on the other hand, the public sector, which itself is a huge consumer of these materials, can actually influence the creation of supply chain for greener materials, which are more resource efficient and also more energy efficient, and also in our case, labor creating, because that is the need for the context, and thus create a much better social and ecological outcome of material choices. Going forward, there's a little bit of a problem with the mouse. If I may need some help from the UNE, it's not moving. Yeah, the issues that concern us within the space of building materials are basically the following. One is our need to minimize non-renewable virgin material footprint because of the scale of construction, especially in housing, that is going to happen. About 2/3 of our infrastructure is yet to be built, and therefore we require a huge amount of material which will need to be used efficiently and maybe found substitution for. So the consumer information really is to go to ask the consumers or to inform the consumers of the choices that minimize non-renewable virgin material use, such as soils or limestones, etc. The second is, how do we source the material that is renewable but is coming from sustainable sources? Where do we get that information from, and where do we get those materials from? The third is, of course, which is something that the building sector has been very concerned about, is minimizing building energy requirement. But in this case, both in the energy for production, which is the embodied fossil energy in materials, and as well as the fossil energy required for operation and the use of buildings, which is in the life of the building. The third is closing the material energy loops, which is making sure that the waste from the sector go back into reuse, and there is a post-life management. And the final issue, which is of great concern to the country, which is of job creation, because the construction sector is amongst the largest employment sectors in this country, and that we maintain and enhance and improve the quality of skills that come in from the sector. Going forward, yep, there's a next. The housing, the subsector, we had identified 10 aspects which are imperatives for public procurement, but are also equally important for consumer information, things that need to be done. And I will come to some of the experiences that we had in the Mashup project and how we've tried to address that. One is the tools and methods to assess the ecological footprints, job creation, life cycle costs. We heard about the ProGreen a little while back, but which is at one end of it. Then we're looking at eco-labeling, which was another one of the things that we looked at. Standards and benchmarks, which is something that is missing because comparative benchmarks are not available, and so Mashup actually looks at multiple materials together and of the same type. For example, a lot different kinds of bricks that can be used for making walls, and compares the ecological and social impacts of those. Verification and certification systems, they are only nascent and growing in the country. One big issue that we have in the country, which is incentives for industry, for material producers that to become green, and that would then connect to other issues of investments that could go into making the supply chain greener and the capacity development through information and communication. Let's come to Mashup now. Next, yeah. So Mashup is, like I mentioned, a research project of the UNE's One Planet Network. It was implemented over the last 2 years by a group of organizations, the Oxford Brookes University, TERI in India, Development Alternatives, that is my organization, and UN Habitat. And this project provides an assessment method that can be replicated in other countries similar to India, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It is interestingly provides guidelines for policymakers as well as for users, consumers, for this sector in the country. Next. I seem to be having problems with the mouse control, which doesn't work very well. May I request UNE to please help me with that? Yeah. So what this project does is it identified 18 attributes of sustainability that measure performance, and these attributes actually are across the ecological, social, and economic market parameters, but it also identifies user attributes. We'll come to that later. It is based on a robust data framework and an assessment method, and the data framework actually is where then the reliability becomes really significant, because here is where we are looking at different ways the robustness of the data that is coming in from the primary and published sources, also methodologies to calculate these attributes, and we have then mapped the available supply, which is the next thing that the users are looking for. That, okay, if I know what's green and what's sustainable, where am I going to be able to access it? So the project was also mapped out the materials that are available in their geographies when you enter into the website of the project, and it also gives you an assessment of 17 technologies, building materials and systems in construction against all of the 18 parameters, and so you can do a comparative assessment if you want to, and then it gives you design guidelines on how to use those materials to make your building much more energy efficient, resource efficient, etc. And there are, like I mentioned, policy recommendations for mainstreaming sustainability. Next. Yeah, so these are the 18 attributes. You can see them in 4 clusters. The first cluster is resource efficiency, which looks at both material resources, virgin resources. It looks at the possibility of using recycled content and recyclability of the material itself that we are talking about. And it also talks about water use. The operational performance is much more from the perspective of the homeowner, the person who will ultimately be using that building from which these materials will go on to make. The acceptability, which is a big issue as far as materials are concerned, and economic impacts from the cost perspective, but also from the skill and job creation potential. Those attributes that are marked in red are actually those that have very high level of reliability, if I may say. They are based on data that is available, calculated, verified, published. The one which is light pink in supply chain actually is also primary data, but it is mapped and it is updated as it is and it is possible to update it on the map. The ones that are in green are looked at from an estimation perspective. I mean, they're calculated based on certain methodologies, but these would all change as improvements in industry happen. The ones in yellow are actually the qualitative information, and they are based on user surveys and therefore have a lesser level of, if I may say so, reliability. So we are able to identify which of these attributes and indicators can have much higher level of reliability and calculation, and those which need to be scored on the basis of the of assessments that are made. Going forward, the next slide. The Mashup offers you a website in which you are able to look for what an assessment method, and it tells you about where, why you should be doing that, how you can actually assess yourself, what are the parameters that you would be assessing, and where. So you could actually enter in your geography specific project that you're going to be working in as a user, like an architect or a developer, and be able to select materials and identify how sustainable that choice is. And as far as for whom is concerned, it's basically for a range of stakeholders, so homeowners who could enter into the website their information, a very simple information, and be able to understand the choices they made, to professionals like architects or project developers, and also government policy makers. It provides you, for those 17 technologies that have been assessed, very detailed technology profiles with all the information about the 18 attributes. It also gives you a do-it-yourself support system in the website itself that you can do a self-assessment of this choice that you are making. Next. Okay. Again, because now we are looking at multi-criteria assessment, what it does is that it enables a choice making based on a weighted attribute. So, for example, if a stakeholder feels that virgin resource material used within the building material is of very high value to that stakeholder, and you would like to regulate that or use less of it, you could actually choose your technology based on that one parameter alone, or you could have multiple parameters that you would like to use along with virgin material. For example, whether or not the material that I use will be eventually recyclable, or whether that material has higher amount of recycled content in it, or whether that material has enabled a higher job creation in its production. So one could use a variety of parameters and make a choice on the basis of that. It also gives us a potential, and it has not yet been done so far, but the potential exists to set a benchmark of a minimum criteria or a maximum criteria in any of these parameters, which is useful from the perspective of regulatory authorities. It can be used to establish these boundary conditions. So if, for example, you would like to give a better credit rating for a for a housing development using certain materials, then you could use these boundary conditions as part of your tender and call for project budgets. Based on the data framework and the method for calculation, product information disclosure is also a possibility that the producers can now start using. Next. Now we will go to, so it has, like I mentioned, a huge range of applications. The slide here sort of briefly describes the kind of technology profile that's available. This particular example that I've used is from compressed stabilized earth block masonry, very popular in the south of India at the moment, and not so popular in the north or other parts of the country, but it gives you all the 18 parameters. It also gives you the sources of information for where this parameter has, where the data has been collected from, and you could use this information to decide whether or not you want to use this material. The 17 technologies that we have assessed are in the two tables on the left. You have the blue color, which is the table on the top gives you the current material which are popular, and the ones that are below in mauve, these are the technologies that are emerging and have been identified by the government under their social housing project. So this project actually assessed both the emerging technologies as well as popular and established building materials. It also assessed integrated systems, because there are systems in construction which you cannot separate as wall or roof, and they're integrated. So this is able to do that as well. Next. Yeah, and so this is an example of the mapping, which has been done on a GIS platform. This particular figure shows you where the fly ash sources are, which is a raw material that you use to make fly ash bricks, which have a very high content of this recycled material, this waste material from power plants, and therefore has a very low carbon footprint and a low virgin material footprint. And so we've been able to map that across the country, so the users know where they can reach out to for their for the material if they want to. And we've based on the available data and information, some of the 18, not all 18 could be mapped, but some of the 18 can be mapped. And now this is a mapping system which is dynamic, and there is in the website a method in which the suppliers and the producers of material can actually enter in their information, and they would come into the map. Thus, you're able to get much more. As you go forward year by year, you can update the information. Next.
Zinat, sorry to interrupt you, but I think we've gone way over time. So
I'm going to be the last slide now. Yeah.
Okay. So
and just look at the recommendations. I think I'll just highlight 2 points here, which is important from the perspective of information available to users. One is that we desperately need to make environmental quality standards and disclosures for building material mandatory, such that information is available to all consumers. At the moment, it's not mandatory for producers. And the second is that we need to set up a market ecosystem supported by policy, such that there are greater supply chains for these materials, so that consumers can access. This is one big challenge that they feel, that even if they know, where do they get? So these are the 2 most important things at the moment that we need to work on. So that's all for now. Thank you, and I apologize for going over time. Aish. I can hand over to.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. Good morning. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present. I'm going to go very briefly over another of the projects that was funded also by the One Planet Network and the Sustainable Buildings and Construction sub-program, which is called Sherpa. This was also a project that was developed with a consortium of different partners, namely CATER, which is an academic institution in France, VTT Finland, the University of Cambridge, along with other NGOs like Architects Without Borders Nepal, YAM Solidarité in Burkina Faso, Ecosur Network in Latin America, and the Kenya Slum Upgrading Project. Let me see if my mouse is now working. Yes, it does. Okay. So the quick presentation will just go through a background very quickly on what do we consider about sustainability in the housing sector, what do consumers know about sustainability assessments for the building sector, and then I'll just guide you through what Sherpa is and how does it work. These are some of the important figures that we use in UN Habitat. Currently, 1.6 billion people live in inadequate housing conditions globally, out of which 2.4 billion people live without improved sanitation, and 2 billion people are affected by water stress. At a global level, 19% of the global energy consumption occurs at the household levels, and 40% of global energy use is used by the overall building stock, that is manufacturing, construction, and maintenance operations of buildings. Why is the housing sector important for us? Well, because UN Habitat and their studies, we estimate that in any given area in the world, you have 50 to 75% of the surface of cities, which is devoted to residential uses. In some areas, such as Latin America or the Middle East, this can even go to 80%. So there's a strong link between the sustainability of the housing sector and the sustainability of cities. But then what do consumers know about sustainability assessments when it comes to the building sector? I think many people here, and especially our colleagues from the other sub-programs of the One Planet Network, will have heard about different building sustainability assessments. Famous ones are LEED, BREEAM, Passive House. And UN Habitat, along with other partners, published a study about different building sustainability assessments and benchmarks to understand what is the added value of these assessments and benchmarking schemes. The main findings is that there is still in the world a very low uptake of these certification schemes and the different labels for redundancy labeling the building sector sustainable. And this is because most certification and benchmark assessing schemes have substantial costs that not all sectors can cater to, namely public buildings, let alone affordable and social housing. In order to certify buildings or constructions, you need a high level of skill required. These assessments take time. And yes, there is a growing demand for many of them. Of course, there are some interesting benchmarking assessment schemes in South Africa and India that are growing quite rapidly. But this demand is still marginal when you compare it to the bulk of constructions and buildings that are still being done around the world, let alone all the ones that are being done in an informal way. So this is where Sherpa came in. Now, the word Sherpa is not an acronym, it's just a name. It's someone that guides you. So it's an application that we developed to guide people towards a more sustainable housing project. What is Sherpa? It's a set of indicators that instead of assessing your tool on its own, it's a set of indicators that allow you to self-assess your own project. It does it with a free and easy to use and intuitive app that you can find online. And it is directed to project managers, communities, stakeholders involved in the planning, design, and construction of housing projects. It was designed to be used in the design phase of a housing project, but we have noticed that it is also very useful to monitor. How does it work? Well, it's the main thinking about Sherpa is to go to the process instead of the product. We're not certifying the end product. We're certifying the whole way of thinking around sustainability by reinforcing participation and linking all of this to the different SDG frameworks, SDG goals, and urban agenda. And earlier in the presentations, it was discussed that there are 3 dimensions to sustainability. That is perfectly correct. But Sherpa, we decided to have those 3 dimensions, economic, social, and environmental, but add a focus on a, let's say, a sub-dimension to sustainability, which is cultural. Because when we talk about buildings and constructions and the informal sector in least and middle income countries, cultural sustainability plays a very, very important role. Sherpa assesses these 4 different dimensions of sustainability: social, economic, environmental, and cultural. But then it looks into housing projects, and this is not a single housing unit, but we're talking about 20 to 1,000 units designed in a project, and looks into the processes around these projects, how the territory is impacted and changed along with the project, as well as the neighborhood, and finally the household scale itself, which is everything that is very easy to understand. That said, the application is structured in this way. You go into the app, you are confronted with lots of different questions related to your project, and you have to answer accordingly. So this is an example. It says, to what degree were stakeholders involved in the architectural design process? In order to explain what is meant by the question, we have a quick explanation of the question. For instance, here it says, there are several levels of participation, ranging from no participation to decision. And are the existing techniques of a participative design applied? Are different options proposed and understood by all participants? And then you answer as a project designer, manager, or someone that is monitoring a project. You will answer, well, not at all, because the stakeholders were not informed during the architectural design process. Or you, let's say on the other spectrum of the answers, you answer, yes, it's an active question because stakeholders had an active role in the architectural design process. This is just an example. The application works in that way, and it has lots of different questions that without much analysis, it's quite intuitive. You just start answering these questions and you start clicking on the answers to not at all, medium, medium high, and completely accepted, or not applicable in some projects. This is a screenshot of the application in Spanish because we have it already translated in French, Spanish, and English. And in the end, you get these very simple bars that show how your project is doing with regards to the environmental, cultural, economic, social dimensions of sustainability, or you can even go to the different subsections, the scales of the application. Just the last quick example before I finish. For instance, we recently went to Kalobeye, a refugee camp in North Kenya, at the beginning of the year. And we were assessing some of the designs being done by UN Habitat in line with architecture firm Shigeru Ban, and to make some more durable solutions to refugees there, to change a bit the paradigm of the tented camp and try to make some better designs. So we tested out different typologies there, and we found out through Sherpa that we can have some environmental design improvements if we use the local vegetation so that the designs are protected from the wind. We, for instance, found that we could increase cultural adequacy if we use local weaving skills that are typical from the Turkana community. And this would be useful to increase privacy in some semi-public areas of the housing typologies. We detected some cost inefficiencies on the supply chain because we were using, well, the project designers were trying to use a very trademark material by Shigeru Ban, which are these paper cardboards. But the issue was not the importing of the paper cardboards. There was an issue in the supply chain from Mombasa to Nairobi that increased the cost substantially. And this was found through addressing some of the questions of Sherpa. And of course, capacity building is an important thing that we always talk about in projects. By addressing some of the questions in Sherpa in the group of all the skilled workers that were taking the assessment during one day, we found out that several of the workers had expertise on other topics that the project manager was not aware of. And they just got new jobs after using Sherpa as electricians, as plumbers. So the idea is that Sherpa allows you to know more about your project, to be much more aware of your project. It is a low-cost assessment. It's a consumer-friendly approach. And it allows you as a project manager to communicate with the beneficiaries and inform the consumers in a much more easier way. So these are the main points that I wanted to address on this project and link it a bit to the consumer information webinar. This is the end of the presentation. I do encourage you, if you have any questions, to get in touch with me, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesus. We are handing over to Jeremy now, who's giving some input from his point of view on the previous presentations and the discussion today.
Yes. Okay, what I'm going to do is that we've gone through a lot of detail, and I think before we get to the discussion, I'm going to stand back a little bit and look at some of the kind of macro factors. There are many different systems around, and sometimes it's very confusing. How do you choose which to use? So what I'm going to go through is fairly quickly a few questions that you can use to look at systems and see whether these are right for your particular situation. Next. So the questions that I'm going to suggest that you ask is, first of all, is how does the system define sustainability? The second one is, does the system address your local, your particular priorities, your local issues? Very important that that is always a priority in terms of the local situation. The third one is, a lot of systems have a very strong emphasis on technical performance of the building or the system, and it always takes a change in behavior. And what I would suggest is very important is that you ask whether there's a corresponding change in behavior as well as the change in the system, and do the systems support that? The very last one, which is perhaps the most difficult, is an evidence base. Are there studies? is it clear that what the system is requiring you to do is going to achieve the required level of change, the required type of change? So it's asking more about the science behind the system. Next. And if we think about sustainability, it's very important in definitions not just to have an emphasis on carbon. They are very good tools just for carbon, and if you are interested in just carbon, use those tools. But if you're interested in sustainability, look at the kind of broader definitions. And there's two useful, I think, ideas, conceptual ideas. The first is the idea of an environmental ceiling. So this says there are certain limits within the environment related to things like water, carbon emissions, etc. And if we breach those, if we go beyond those, we are unsustainable. The second one is around social flaws, which is the idea that there's certain minimum standards of quality of life. So minimum standards of education, of health, of purchasing price parity, being able to work, etc. And again, the Sustainable Development Goals is very much about that. But there are other indicators like the UN's Human Development Index that also measures these aspects. So look at the definition and make sure that it's a broad definition that's linked back to science and to proper, well-recognized global standards and systems. Next. And this becomes, I think, particularly important when you think about where you are located. So this is a graph from the World Wildlife Fund, and the y-axis shows the ecological footprint, and the x-axis shows the Human Development Index. And what they've plotted is a gray rectangle, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, which, for the sake of this definition, is what is sustainability. So sustainability in this definition, it would be under 1.8 global hectares. That's below the gray on the y-axis, which means that there's certain limits in terms of lifestyles, in terms of consumption, in terms of waste. On the other scale, you can see the other threshold is 0.8. So 0.8 of the Human Development Index is the minimum quality of life standards. So the minimum levels of education, health, purchasing price parity. And what the World Wildlife Fund have done on this particular graph is locate countries and show their development trajectories. So as you'd expect, a lot of countries in Europe, and the United States, Australia, all have very good quality of life standards. So they're well beyond 0.8. However, the ecological footprints are far too high. So the key trajectory, development trajectory, is to lower the ecological footprint, to reduce the environmental impact in those areas. So that's what the emphasis would be. In developing countries, so countries in Africa, Asia, you have that yellow arrow, and the emphasis here is to improve quality of life standards without increasing the ecological footprint, so that you can get towards that gray rectangle. So it's very important to understand where you are. A LEED platinum in the middle of an informal settlement is a ridiculous idea, because it takes a lot of the criteria from the US and brings it locally to somewhere where a lot of the priorities are totally different. They're around social issues and economic issues. So think about where you are and which definition of sustainability and which priorities are most important. Next. The next issue is really this needing to understand how people behave. This IPAT, or I times P times C equation from Ehrlich, is very useful, because what it says is that environmental impact is the size of the population times the levels of consumption and waste and technology. So the C is a very important part of this. And in buildings, we can do a lot to change behavior. We can design, make it very easy, make it far more attractive, use social pressure to change behavior and make sustainable solutions far more attractive and easy to use than non-sustainable attractives. And I think this is the point that's very important that we need to think about and measure in rating systems when we come to built environments and neighborhoods. Next. The last point is that if we look at the evidence in front of us, there's very little evidence that many of these systems are actually working. If we look at carbon emissions, so the climate tracker graph on the left shows that we're on the worst trajectory and very little has changed. If we look at a lot of the sustainable development goals in most countries, not just South Africa, a lot of places like Finland, Sweden, etc., many of those goals aren't being achieved. And so what this means is it means that our choice of tools, our choice of policies, our choice of strategies aren't working. And we need to do two things. The first thing is that we need to be far more realistic and choose targets that perhaps are far more stringent. So we need science-based targets. And there's a whole new movement that is developing around this that gives far more accurate and challenging targets, and those are the ones that we need to achieve. The second part to this is that once we have those clear, objective, science-based targets, we have to use systems that work, that will make that change. And so we need the evidence to show that the particular choice of tools or strategy or policy will actually change. And the last part of that is because some of this is new, we need to start piloting the methodologies quicker, monitoring the results, and then upscaling it. And that's some of the work that we need to do far more rapidly because the scale and level of change is very large. And so we need systems that are going to do that. And we mustn't spend a lot of time on systems and indicators that make very marginal changes or may actually waste time or go in the wrong direction. And so, my last point is that we need proper evidence-based methods and the right targets to aim for to achieve the change we need. Next. I think that's my last slide.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks very much. Thanks to all the presenters. We don't have a lot of time for a facilitated discussion session, but I would like to remind the webinar participants that if you do have a question, to please use your chat box or your question section of the webinar tool to pose your question. I just wanted to perhaps as a discussion starter, show you a few slides just to highlight what might be the context and the areas that you're looking at. So for instance, if you take us to the next slide, please, Nils. This is what you might see very commonly in Asia. So the context within which buildings and construction operates in different countries and different regions are different, and therefore the priorities that you contend with in these regions are also quite different. The next slide, Nils, please, shows you an example of what you might expect in a slum settlement in Latin America, but this could equally be in Asia or in any of the Pacific Islands. And the next slide, Nils. This is actually a slide of a slum settlement that we visited in Argentina, and it's probably one of the, for me at least, a highlight that a slum settlement could go up to 4 or even 5 stories high. just goes to show the demands of the desperation of housing in these areas. The next slide. So I'd like to open it out for questions. If anybody has one, again, please remember to use the chat box or the question part of the webinar tool to pose your question. If you're still thinking about a question, perhaps I might use my prerogative as facilitator to ask each of the tool presenters, Zeenath, Jesus, and perhaps even yourself, Jeremy. Clearly, what has been identified through the consumer information guidelines that has been developed, one of the important things there was transparency in the system and transparency to enable consumers to make decisions. Zeenath, Jesus, and Jeremy, would you like to comment? Perhaps starting with Zeenath first.
Thank you, Usha, for this. Yes, I would. I think one of the important things within the building and construction sector, especially in India, is this sort of lack of knowledge about what I'm using. So I, as a consumer, if I'm a homeowner, will use what I have always been comfortable with or what my neighbors have been comfortable with, what is popularly available, but I don't really know what goes into it. And so I'm not choosing with respect to sustainability parameters, I'm choosing with respect to cost. On the other hand, when I am I'm a developer or a government organization that is doing a social housing project, my choice is based on what will give me fastest construction and what will give me cheapest construction. So the rest of the sustainability options are not available. They are not known. They're not known also because a lot of the data is not there verified, and many of the most, in fact I should say, producers and consumers do not make that data easily available. It is hidden. So the first thing is on a framework, a very robust data framework on which the data can be disclosed, and then communication of that data in a form that the consumer can digest easily, can understand easily. And I think that's a big issue when in the construction industry in India. Even in the largest housing scheme that we have, the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, urban and rural, the technologies that are being promoted do not have the kind of information that a developer or a homeowner can choose on the basis of defined sustainability parameters. So yes, transparency and the robustness of that information, they are issues within it.
Thank you, Zeenath. Jesus, would you like to make a quick comment, please?
Sure, Usha, thanks so much for the question. Just to complement on what Zeenath was saying, I think that besides all of this robust information for consumers, it's also just as important to understand what is meant by all of these parameters, by all of these criteria. Just as Jeremy was pointing out, sometimes it's a bit blurry to talk about sustainability, especially if we are using terms like green, like bio-based, etc. So some of the things that we addressed in Sherpa was exactly this topic. And this is why Sherpa, with each questions that you get asked, assuming that people working in informal settlements, people working in NGOs might need to have some sort of notions that are sometimes quite difficult to convey, Sherpa gives you these very easy explanations as to why should you consider certain things? Why should you think about a project being able to provide with enough water supply for the next 30 years? Why should you think about a good location, and what are the consequences of not thinking about this when you do a housing project, etc.? So the explanation and being transparent in the way that you convey the information in a clear way, and using the internationally agreed standards, it's also just as important for consumers.
Thank you, Jesus. We literally have 1 minute left. Jeremy, could you keep your response to 30 seconds or less, if possible?
I'll be very quick. Yeah, very quick. I think the two points that come through very strongly. The first is cost, and I think, you know, where sustainable materials are too expensive, one of government's roles is to make them cheaper, make them accessible. The second one is local content, is that if you can make sure that your materials are locally sourced, there's a lot of aspects of sustainability that are already sorted out, like creating local jobs and living with the environmental impacts locally. So I think those two issues, I think, are very important.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here because we're just on the dot, 8 p.m. my time here. Thank you all very much for joining this webinar. Please remember that we do have another webinar coming up next week on the 16th of October. So please feel free to join in. And once again, I would like to thank Consumer Information Program, Nils and Bettina, for organizing this session, and our speakers, Jeremy, Jesus, and Zina. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.